Hello, my name is Kathy Barkdahl, and I'm glad to be here with you on another one of our series of catechist certification for the Diocese of Boise. This one today we're going to be talking about, it's an advanced certification class on Christology. So I hope that you will be able to enjoy this journey with me, and we will go on from there. I've been in parish ministry for about 30 years as a catechist and an office manager and a DRE and a pastoral associate. So I'm really excited to be here with you today to be able to share what I have learned about how Jesus impacts my life and hopefully yours. So I'd like to start out with an opening prayer. And part of it's a little bit of my Irish background, but the breastplate of St. Patrick really speaks to me, especially when it comes to Jesus. So I'd like to begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lay down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. Amen. So today, we're going to be talking about how do we do Christology, and how is it that we can be able to incorporate Jesus into our lives. Christology is the process of interpreting one's faith experience of God, alive in and through Jesus the Christ. As in all theology, Christology originates in our faith experience of God. There are two foundations of Christology. The first is in Jesus, because communities of believers come to awareness of the transcendent in the very person of Jesus. And through Jesus, because believers experience God and God's transforming light and love through the words, the actions, and events of Jesus' life. Experiencing God in Jesus calls for new commitments. To forgive others, to love our enemies, to accept the cross in our lives, to live in hope of a personal resurrection, to have absolute trust in the transcendent, and to have an unconditional commitment of our lives. Christology is a process. It's looking at the words and the deeds of Jesus, the life, death, and resurrection, Jesus' mediatorship, and the personal presence of Jesus. When we interpret our experience of God, we filter it through these. Even those who knew Jesus firsthand, the first disciples, interpreted their faith experiences in and through Jesus. And they began to ask questions of, where did this man get all of this? What kind of wisdom has been given to him? Who is this man who was a lowly carpenter, the son of Mary? How does he act in the name of God? So when we look at the process of Christology, it is meeting God and Jesus in the community through beliefs handed on by the church. It is finding God alive within many interpretations. It's responding to Jesus' question, who do you say that I am? And it is gathering the responses from the past, those in the present, and search for a meaning for today. And in order to do this, this requires one to listen to the interpretations and how they resonate in us and within the contemporary community of all believers. And it's also to look at how do these new and renewed interpretations allow us to move into a fuller commitment to God and discipleship. The main source of Christology is the Gospels. This is the starting point of understanding Christology. It begins with these texts, interpreting them for our own generation. The Gospels precede and provide the basis for every effort that we do in Christology. Christology is not something that just is, but it's something that we do. It's an actual task that we have to undertake to help further our relationship with God through Jesus. Christology did not begin with the composition of these sacred books, but these sacred documents are the examples of the fruits of the earliest Christological processes, and we get to benefit from the fruits of that. The early authors of the Gospel model for us what Christology entails and also how the process of doing Christology should be accomplished. So we all know that there are 4 Gospels, and these are works of literature written specifically for people of faith by people of faith. They're not to be regarded as chronologies or historical records, although there are some historical facts in each of the Gospels, but that's not the purpose that they were written. They are not apologetic writings to defend a community's faith and beliefs before non-believers. These were all written to help bolster and to increase the faith in the community of believers already. They strive to preserve the memory of Jesus for those who have been touched by him. After Jesus' ascension into heaven and a period of time that went by and Jesus didn't come back, and they felt like they had to start recording these memories so that they would not be lost. They strive to inspire and strengthen the faith of a group of people in their own present struggle. We'll see in a few minutes, each one of the communities of each gospel had their own issues that they were dealing with. And each one of the evangelists wrote directly in correlation to that. The Gospels are short episodes and stories that are easily narrated and remembered, because these were not documents that were printed, that people didn't have easy access to this written word back then. So they were done in little short, when we think of the parables, these stories were something that were very easy to remember. Most of us can, almost by memory, we can tell someone a story of a parable. Even if we don't get all the words right, we can get the intent of why it was written. So they were something that could be easily passed down from generation to generation. The Gospels are expressions of faith in the times and situations during Jesus' earthly life, in the times and the situations within the early church, and in the reflections of the times and the situations within the Gospels themselves. The Gospels are expressions of faith that mature by a series of reflective stages. They would have looked at what was going on historically and culturally in the world of Jesus, and also what was happening as far as history and culture during the time the early disciples and the first Christians were spreading the good news of Jesus' life, his ministry, death, and resurrection through their preaching and catechizing. How would the Gospels have influenced and possibly modified by the times and situations when each gospel was composed? And we'll see how, with the changing of the times, as each gospel was written, how the stories may be very similar, but the meaning behind them is going to be just interpreted a little differently. Each evangelist's portrait of Jesus was specifically tailored to meet the historical needs of each respective gospel community. And each community was influenced by the process of interpreting Jesus precisely in light of their own distinct historical challenges. So each community had a role in shaping their tradition. So we have 4 Gospels, and there are 4 main images of Christ. All 4 Gospels give us account of the same Jesus in his life, his ministry, his death, and his resurrection. So we know that each one of those has touched on some element of those. And each gospel includes an accounting specifically of Jesus' baptism, his preaching and teaching, his wondrous healing, both physical and spiritual, his compassion for the marginalized and the abandoned of Israel, his growing conflict with the religious authorities of the day, his trial and crucifixion, and his appearances after the resurrection. Although there are distinct differences in each one of the gospel accounts, these core images remain the same in each one of them. So the first gospel we're going to look at is the community of the Gospel of Mark. Now, Bibles list them as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But we're going to start with Mark because that was the first gospel to be written. And we'll see as we go along that Mark kind of set the tone for the other 3. Mark's gospel was written in and for Jewish and Gentile Christians who were still living in Rome. It was written prior to the year 70, but after the death of the Apostle Peter. And this was before the fall of the temple and the city of Jerusalem. The community of Mark was under a pervasive threat of persecution under the Emperor Nero. There had been a war between the Romans and the Jews of Palestine. This was about 66 to 70 that left them vulnerable to imperial suspicion, if not outright retaliation. They were regarded as ungodly because they had separated themselves from the pagan worship that the Romans believed in. Persecution was physical, political, psychological, and social. Nero had persecuted many, including Peter and Paul, who eventually suffered martyrdom. These were Roman Christian communities who were not unified with one single leadership. Because of the persecution that they were constantly under the threat of, they met in separate local house churches instead of meeting as a large community, which led to professing some different attitudes regarding their own beliefs and what they believed about Gentile converts' obligations in relationship to their Jewish heritage. Things such as, what is the Jewish obligation of circumcision for Gentiles coming in? There were a lot of heated discussions between, especially James and Peter, over things like this. So they kind of squabbled between themselves of, they were just starting out and trying to figure out how this was going to work. Attempts were made to kind of influence each other, well, we're right and you're wrong, and trying to convince other members. So this led to some disharmony, as well as to, the other elements of the persecution. So this was a gospel that was written to empower the Christians living there at that time to live in fidelity of Christ, but also to figure out a way to live in harmony with each other. So the Christ of the Gospel of Mark is This is the shortest and most direct of the four gospel accounts. Events move very quickly in Mark's gospel, beginning with the baptism of Jesus and then moving straight into his ministry. Jesus is presented as a healer and an exorcist. He becomes a very compelling figure where people are immediately drawn to him by his power to heal. These were Christians living in oppression where there was a need for a divine healer in their lives. His healing power also extended to people who had been deemed as outsiders, pagans and Gentiles. And so he emerged very quickly and with mounting energy as a powerful healer, because this spoke to them deeply. He was the risen Jesus, alive for us forever. The Christ of Mark instructs his disciples, "These signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will drive out demons, speak new languages, lay hands on the sick, and they will recover." So Mark's Christ, as the risen Christ, alive in his church, is Jesus the healer and the exorcist. He is the faithful servant of God. Mark announces right from the very beginning of his gospel, Jesus Christ, Son of God, chosen one, faithful servant. Terms that had been applied to the people of Israel and any devout or law-abiding Jew. This is repeated at Jesus' baptism when we hear, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." The reader immediately is invited to understand Jesus as the faithful and beloved servant of God. He is also the suffering servant, laboring under suspicion of authority. When Jesus forgives the paralytic, dines with the tax collector, doesn't follow the rules of fasting, like plucking the heads off of grain on the Sabbath, or when he has the audacity to cure on the Sabbath, his very faithfulness to God sparks threats of persecution. Mark reflects on the image of Jesus is the faithful servant of God, suffering rejection from the beginning. He wasn't even accepted in his own hometown of Nazareth. Jesus himself predicts his passion when he says the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed and rise after 3 days. And Mark also details the starkness of Jesus' final moments. Jesus' prayer in the garden is especially painful. There's the continued disbelief of the apostles, Peter's denial, and the desertion of all his disciples. Complete abandonment is vividly told in Mark with the story of the man wearing only the loincloth, who is seized by the disciples, and when he runs away, they're left only with the cloth, leaving him to run away naked. What this tells us is these are the same disciples who left everything, their families, their fishing nets, to follow him. But in the end, they leave everything behind to get away from him. He is left to endure the crucifixion alone, the epitome of one destined to suffer. And Jesus as the way to salvation, or the way to salvation is to walk with Jesus. Because this was a community who was suffering greatly under persecution, that by giving them the example of Jesus as enduring personal rejection, abandonment, persecution, and the cross, then they were able to relate that, the way to salvation, even if we're under persecution, that it's available. Mark affirms unconditionally in the words of a non-disciple, the Roman centurion, when he says, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." So bringing it right back to where he was at the beginning of the gospel, that yes, this Jesus is the way to salvation. Mark sought to bolster the Christian's allegiance to Christ, emphasizing the fact that suffering and persecution were not obstacles to salvation, but constituted the way to salvation and life. So the next gospel is the Gospel of Matthew. So this community, it was written in and for Jewish and Gentile Christians in Antioch. This was written within the 10-year period of the 80s. This was a church that had survived the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the fall of the city to the Romans. So this was after they had gone through all this. There was the diaspora where they were just spread out. You know, they had left what they knew, what was familiar, and now they were starting anew in very different places. This was a community that had an increasing number of Gentile converts. And they had the challenge of how to remain faithful to their Jewish roots as God's chosen people, and to Jesus, because he was a Jew, in this ever-increasing Gentile Christian community. They were starting to lose their identity. They faced the challenge of how to continue to evangelize Gentiles, which almost seemed contrary to them compared to the Jewishness of the historical Jesus. So there was a little bit of inner turmoil there. They struggled with how to respond to this widespread diversity, the mix of rich and poor, a variety of opinion, variations among members, and intensity and fidelity of their Christian living. When they had been in Jerusalem, everyone was kind of on the same level, and everyone had pretty much the same mindset. But now here they were with all these different people coming from different backgrounds. It was a community that knew a fair degree of stability and peace, even though they were still confused and they were living someplace where they were unfamiliar, but the area itself was peaceful. So this allowed a time of reflection and careful study of the law. It's thought that Matthew was probably a scribe, well-versed in the law. And so this community had a stronger inclination toward kind of a moderately conservative stance of the Mosaic law. And the Pharisees still exerted a powerful influence on them in Antioch. The challenge for the community was to free themselves from the dominance of this Pharisaic Judaism and all the burdensome restrictions, all the laws that they were asked to follow. And they were struggling to understand why Jesus had not returned after the fall of Jerusalem. But Matthew separates this question of the destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem with the question of the final return of Jesus. They had just gone through one of the most horrific periods in their history, and they were lost. They didn't know what to do without Jesus. So Matthew there are several parables that help them to get through this. He talks about the wicked servant who acts foolishly when the master is long delayed, or the foolish virgins who lack sufficient oil for their lamps to meet the long-delayed bridegroom. So the Jesus of Matthew's gospel teaches that the disciple must sustain and deepen his or her faith even in the absence of Jesus, to always be prepared, to stay awake, and to know that they were on the right path. So the Christ of the Gospel of Matthew, there is the same ministry, death, and resurrection of Mark in Matthew. In fact, it's pretty much known that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke drew from the writings of Mark. Matthew writes of a Jesus who heals, casts out devils, suffers, dies, and rises. But Matthew also underscores aspects of Jesus' origins, his life. We have the infancy narratives in the Gospel of Matthew, and his ministry, that all those things kind of lie in the background of Mark. You know that he had to have been born. He had to have been raised in a Jewish family, but none of that appears in Mark, but we know it's hanging there in the background. So Matthew draws that forward. He presents Jesus with the human origins as the son of David. He talks about him as the son of David, son of Abraham. In fact, David is mentioned 5 times in the Gospel of Matthew. He ties Christ tightly to Jewish history and the Davidic line. He talks about the royal Messiah, the anointed one, come to establish the long-awaited kingdom of Israel. But Matthew also quickly notes the expansiveness of Christ's reign with the story of the Magi, who were non-Jews. So he lets them know that it's okay. You're in a Gentile world now. And it's also for the Gentile converts of knowing that Jesus was there for everyone. Matthew's Christ is born with a universal stature, destined to rule both Jew and Gentile. So Matthew's attempt is to address a community of diversity, but not disunity. It's okay to be different, but as long as we're together. He compares Jesus to Moses. He has stories like when Herod's command to kill the newborn. So Mary and Joseph and the infant seek refuge in Egypt and return safely to establish the new promised land. This correlates with Moses' story of when he was threatened, he found protection in Egypt and then eventually was able to lead God's people to the promised land. Matthew stresses Jesus' teaching mission, unfolding the new law of the new kingdom, just as Moses received the law on Mount Sinai. He also talks of Jesus as the new lawgiver. This new law requires a new and fuller responsiveness on the part of the disciple. It's not just following a list of rules, but we actually have to do something. He says not only must one love one's neighbor, but one must love and even pray for one's enemies as well. So in some ways, these laws might have been easier, but they were more difficult internally. But Jesus also says that more is required, but more is also promised. Jesus mediates the new law in a new way. And Matthew's Jesus does not disregard the law, though. He says, I'm sent not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. He does, however, he kind of nuances the law. He says things like, it is not just the poor, but the poor in spirit. Not just the hungry, but those who hunger and thirst for justice who will receive their fill. He tells them they are not obligated to pay taxes, but he does instruct them to pay them to avoid controversy or offense. Matthew shows careful sensitivity to the concrete issues facing his hearers. Matthew also, he names Peter as the center of this unity. The Jesus of Matthew addresses the question of the influence of the Pharisees by focusing on Peter and the central role he plays. Peter as the rock, or Christ's delegate. Peter, who receives the keys to the kingdom, replacing the Pharisees and the Jewish magisterium. Peter's power to bind and to loose, supplanting the Jewish magisterium in determining what is lawful and what is not lawful. And just as Mark commissions his disciples to heal, Matthew instructs them to make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And he puts Peter at the lead of that. But he also leaves us with some very explicit guidelines for expressing this authority. To exercise authority with genuine humility. Taking care not to mislead the innocent. Seek out the wayward and the sinner. Foster the conversion of the obstinate. Extend God's mercy again and again and again. So this is much different than what they had been used to in the Jewish law. So our third gospel, the community of the Gospel of Luke. This was also written in the mid-80s, so it would have been written pretty close to the same time that Matthew's Gospel was written. And they were also survivors of an era of persecution under the Emperor Nero. But this community was in a Greek-speaking Gentile community without the authoritative leadership of Peter and Paul. This community of Luke did not have strong Jewish Christian membership, so that freed them up a little bit more from the influence of the Pharisees. But they also had little first-hand knowledge of their Jewish roots. Even though it had only been a few years, they were starting to lose that memory, especially being in a new community who didn't have that history. This gospel and the other book attributed to Luke, the Acts of the Apostles, were composed to strengthen the faith and the life of the community in Christ. Without the strong leadership of Peter and Paul, or a clear sense of their history in Judaism, these communities didn't have an easy access to their tradition. So there was a need to attain a sense of their own election as God's chosen people. They asked the question of how is God calling them to live not as Jewish Christians, nor Gentile Christians in a Jewish Christian context, but as Gentile Christians in a purely Gentile world. So this was a whole new place for Christianity. And how could they maintain their fidelity to Jesus and to his message, given their separation from the synagogues and the teachings of Peter and Paul? And how do they understand the future in light of the fact that Christ's return had been delayed? So they were grappling with a lot of issues here. And again, the Gospel of Luke is very dependent on the Gospel of Mark for a lot of the stories, and a lot of the information that are in it come directly from Mark. So the Christ of the Gospel of Luke, Christ as the prophetic advocate of the poor. The Jesus of Luke brings mercy and calls forth justice to the poor. He starts immediately in the first 2 chapters of the infancy narrative, where he anticipates the mission of Jesus in the Canticle of Mary and the Canticle of Zechariah, where it said that his mercy is from age to age, to give people knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sin because of the tender mercy of our God. So Luke points out right from the beginning that Jesus is destined to express the compassion and mercy of God. Luke's initial proclamation of the presence of the reign of God is directed towards the poor. This leaves the reader to understand that God, through Jesus, intends his blessing precisely for those who suffer from material poverty and physical hunger. He says to invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind to their banquets instead of inviting the wealthy. And Luke is especially stern with the wealthy who neglect the poor. But he also affirms the salvation of converts who are generous with their possessions. And this was very important to a group of Christians who knew that they were latecomers to Christianity. And they knew that they almost felt like they were not even God's first choice. So for them to know that all they had to do was to follow what God was asking and be compassionate and have mercy, that salvation would be theirs. Jesus is a prophet of God's compassion and mercy. We hear the stories of the Good Samaritan, the woman with the lost coin, the prodigal son, Christ's compassion on the cross for the good thief. Without a long-standing relationship with the God of Jesus, and coming from a pagan background, they would carry a sense of being deeply sinful. So this compassion and mercy were very important for their transformation process and their conversion. Jesus as a spirit of prayer anointed by the Spirit of God. Luke talks about the Spirit of God being active in Jesus' life right from his conception, with the story of Elizabeth when Mary came to visit her, saying, "The infant leapt in my womb, and she was filled with the Holy Spirit." And then the Holy Spirit goes on to strengthen Jesus for ministry at his baptism by descending upon him in the form of a dove. The Holy Spirit fills him and leads him into the desert where he is renewed for his ministry. And the Spirit empowers him to recognize and praise the ways of God. Luke assures the disciples of God's eagerness to share the Spirit with them. All they had to do is ask, and then they could weather any trial. The work of Jesus originated in the Spirit of God and inspired him in his calling to be compassionate and merciful. And the reader would know that prayer had enabled Jesus to receive this gift of God, so he could accomplish his God-given ministry and his God-given destiny. And the centrality of the Spirit and the gift of forgiveness are underscored with finality as the risen Christ pledges to send the Spirit. This was a promise that he gave to his disciples as he ascended into heaven. This was also a Jesus who was Luke portrayed him as the center of history. Jesus as the unifier of Israel that came before and the Gentiles that came after. Israel was merely the first stage of God's plan, and Luke's gospel gave the Gentiles catechesis on the people who were truly their ancestors and their roots, even though they didn't have that direct line to the original Israelites, that Jesus was their link. Luke traces Jesus' roots not only to Abraham, but to Adam, who was the father of all people. So by relating his ancestry not only to Israel, but to Adam, that's also the ancestry of that of the Gentiles. So putting Jesus as the center of where they came from. And then finally, we see where Luke's gospel continues in the Acts of the Apostles. And here he describes the faithful and the successful efforts and the challenges of the disciples of Paul and the other early church missionaries as they continued Jesus' mission into the future. So lastly, we're going to be talking about the community of the Gospel of John. Now, the Gospel of John was most likely composed in Ephesus near the year 100. So here we are almost 20 years from the last Gospel that was written. So there had been several years that had passed, and a lot of time to do some deeper reflection and to continue that Christology process, and to be able to see how Jesus was speaking to them during this time. And during this time, Ephesus was a sophisticated cosmopolitan commercial center. I mean, think of any of our major big cities that we have now, of New York and San Francisco, and especially some of those harbor towns where there's a lot of new people, a lot of different religious groups and sects. Ephesus would have been home to Jews where their life centered around the synagogue, and Gentiles with a variety of religious convictions. And within the Gentile community, there was an increasing number of Hellenistic or Greek Gnostics. And we'll talk more about the Gnostics in a few minutes. The community of John sought recognition as being open to welcoming everyone into the communion with them. Ephesus became a seat of bitter feuds between Christian and Jewish groups, where the Christians had been excommunicated because the Jewish people finally gave the ultimatum that either you follow it our way or we have to split. So basically they had become excommunicated from their from their Jewish roots. And then there were also battles between Christians and pagans. So as you can see, this was probably a very chaotic, it was probably a very exciting place to be, but it was something that they had a lot of different challenges that they had to overcome. These were also Christians of a very diverse ancestry. Some could trace their roots back to Judaism, but many were Samaritan or Gentile. But all of them had severed their relationship to the Jewish synagogue, and which had actually been the home of the early community of John. So this was something that was just had taken place, and so they were moving into this new direction. But they were united in a profound allegiance to Jesus as the Word made flesh, the pre-existent Son of God. This was very much a believing community that could trace itself back to Jesus through the witness of the beloved disciple, which John depended on in most of his writings. This fourth gospel was written primarily to strengthen and stimulate the Christian faith and the life of its readers. But they were a community that faced many issues. They were the attacks and the persecution from their Jewish antagonists and other religious groups because of all this mixture. If you're ever in a community, when you're faced with that, where there's so many differing views of who God is and how God speaks to me, it can be challenging, to say the least. But John's community was very steadfast in what they thought about Jesus and being the Word made flesh and the pre-existing Son of God. And they really struggled and asked the question, why would anybody question the authority of the one who is? And the one who came from above. I mean, for them, it was crystal clear. And so they really struggled with trying to get the point across to others. And there was the understanding of their origins and defending their beliefs. This was a community that needed a better understanding so they could stand strong against the Gnostic Gentiles and the Jews. So they needed to be able to develop their faith, and that's the main reason for this Gospel of John, was to help them to be able to know exactly what it is that they're understanding, and also how do I defend that. So the groups who influenced the development of the community of John were the Jewish Christians, who were disciples of John the Baptist and the person known as the beloved disciple. There were also Samaritan converts and those who had a deep anti-temple bias, and then the Gentiles. And there were also the demands of fidelity as a disciple of Jesus. Sometimes it's really hard to keep plugging along and to keep fighting these battles. And so John wanted to be able to unite them and to have them be able to have an understanding of themselves as disciples. So their images and their insights into Jesus were both a source of life and a source of conflict because of all the diversity. And the Gospel of John does not outline the way to disciple in Jesus as clearly as the Synoptic Gospels, which is how we refer to Mark, Matthew, and Luke. But he simply says, I am the way. No one comes to the Father except through me. So it was very explicit with John. He knew exactly what he wanted, how he wanted the people to understand this. For the community of John, Jesus is so central, so radically and completely one with the Father, that he himself in the fullness of life is the way to discipleship. So it was very, very simple, but yet it was very, very difficult in some aspects. And again, they were struggling with this as the time just kept passing. Here we are 100 years from when Jesus had left them. And there was no nothing in sight that he was going to be returning, and asking themselves, how do we live and how do we move forward into the future without him? So that was one of the things that John wanted to do, was to try to create a gospel that would help them move forward in the future. Now, there were many influences from the synoptic gospels on the community of John, because here they had 20 years, 15 to 20 years, to hear these stories. So those were things that kind of influenced their understanding. There were the Jews who received the good news through the preaching and witness of those who knew Jesus and saw the risen Christ. In John's gospel, the first disciples to receive John's call, like Andrew, Peter, Nathaniel, and Philip, they're also the ones who first received Jesus' message in the synoptic gospels. We also see that the tradition of the miracles of Jesus in the fourth gospel are similar to the other three, but the signs and the symbols are manifested differently in John's tradition. And also, many of the titles of Jesus in John's gospel reflect the tradition that would have been first received by the early Jewish converts. But John's gospel, his attempt is to lead the disciples into deeper insights and reflection on who Jesus really was. So first we have the disciples of John the Baptist, who were a huge influence. And in John's gospel, John the Baptist gives testimony to Jesus that is far superior to the testimony in the synoptic gospels. He testifies that Jesus is the one who is coming after me, who ranks ahead of me because he existed before me. So John the Baptist proclaims the pre-existence of Jesus. And John the Evangelist presents John the Baptist as the hero who recognizes and testifies to Jesus as the one before all. And there were also the disciples of the beloved disciple. Sometimes we think of him being John, that we hear in the others. We're not really sure who this disciple was for certain, but the person in John's gospel is designated as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He's thought to be a companion of Andrew, and that he first came to know Jesus when they encountered him early on. The beloved disciples' understanding of and belief in Jesus becomes the model of the understanding of the belief of the community of John, because this beloved disciple was so close to Jesus, and so he would have had a deeper understanding than any of the others. And so that was something that the evangelist John wanted to impart on his community. So when John writes, he claims his portrait of Jesus rests on the testimony of an eyewitness whose witness is true. So this validates what he's saying. And then also there's the strong influence of the Samaritan converts, who the Samaritan believers, like the disciples of John the Baptist, they brought with them a richness of their pre-Christian faith also. Now with the Samaritans, they placed emphasis upon Moses and the history prior to the era of the Jewish kings. So that's one reason why they didn't see eye to eye with the typical Jewish tradition and the synagogue, because theirs kind of stopped at a certain point. So John's Jesus is shown as one who has seen God. It is he who has come down, not from the mountain, but from heaven. And this is something they would have understood. This is also where we hear the story of the woman at the well. So having someone, because Samaritans were not welcome in the Jewish tradition. Jesus was condemned for not only talking to a woman, but a Samaritan woman as well. And then another influence were the Jewish Christians who had very strong anti-temple bias. And the thought is that they might have even been influenced from the earlier Gospels by Jesus' experience with the Jewish leadership at the time. And it's these Jews who actually were kind of responsible for the conversion of the Samaritans. Without the ties to the synagogue and to the Jewish hierarchy, they were able to engage and convert the Samaritans without having to worry about any repercussions. And we also see in John's Gospel that there is some of this anti-temple influence in Jesus' condemnation of his Jewish adversaries in the Gospel. And then lastly, there are the Gentile Christians. And these Christians were definitely separated from any possibility of coexistence with the Jewish community. So the community of John was very easy for them to welcome them. And we see this in the 3rd chapter of John, where Jesus tells Nicodemus, God so loved the world that he sent his only Son, that all who believe might not perish, but have eternal life. And we again see it very clearly in chapter 4, in which the Samaritan woman, who had become an accepted disciple, acknowledges Jesus as the Savior of the world. So by including those who didn't have this previous history, but that they valued them as Christians within their group. So we look at the Christ of the Gospel of John. And this is an introduction to the mystery of Christ. John's Gospel is a reflection upon the eternal God, God's pre-existent Word, and God's action through that Word. We see in the Synoptic Gospels that they emphasize Christ's origin and history conceived through the action of God's Spirit. But John's Gospel stresses Christ's origin in eternity, that he was divinely pre-existent. So basically, the 4th Gospel begins where the others leave off. He takes it to that next level. This understanding is introduced quickly with a variety of titles as he enters his public ministry of Lamb of God, Son of God, Rabbi, Messiah, King of Israel. These were all names that were only gradually coming to be applied to Jesus as these communities from the Synoptic Gospels were going through their own Christological processes. So John presumes his readers are familiar with these understandings of Jesus because they had heard them for quite some period of time. John the Evangelist's intention is to lead the reader to a deeper understanding of the mystery of who Jesus was. And again, the pre-existent Word, eternal wisdom, that Jesus was not just God's emissary, sent to deliver the Word as he's portrayed in Mark, nor is he simply a supreme lawgiver, as in Matthew, but he's actually the Word itself, the embodiment of God's own creative wisdom. The Jesus of John's Gospel claims not only to embody, but also to be that saving wisdom and penetrating light. He says, I am the light of the world. Whoever walks with me will have the light of life. Or will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And he is also the revelation of God's glory. That Jesus not only works miracles or wonders, but he also works signs. Signs that manifest God's glory, residing in the person and the actions of Jesus. He transforms water into wine, which results in the disciples beginning to believe in him. He shows that he is the light to the world by giving sight to the man born blind from birth. There is only one truth for John. Jesus is the revelation of God's glory, God's visible saving power for all who believe. And Jesus, the one who is. Jesus names himself in John's Gospel as I am. This was the divine name that Yahweh revealed to Moses. Other names Jesus calls himself: I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. His is an identity that transcends history. Before Abraham even came into existence, I am. So they're starting to get that understanding of that this is not just somebody who was born out of nowhere, that this is someone who has always been with us. The Jesus in the Gospel of John is the transcendent saving God of Israel's history. And this is a Jesus who is the very model of love. Jesus who invites his disciples to be one with him and letting him live with him in his love. When he says, love one another as I have loved you, this is more than just a romantic love, but a love of sacrifice. This establishes deep bonds of personal union between himself and the disciples. He lets them know that the one who sees Jesus sees the Father. This invitation and command to love is voiced time and again, especially to Peter. When we hear the story of Peter, do you love me? And, oh, yes, Master, I do. And Peter, do you love me? I mean, he has to repeat it over and over and over again because Peter, like ourselves, sometimes just didn't get it. But he wanted to let him know that, you're going to be taking over for me. I'm turning the keys of the kingdom to you. So I need to know, do you love me? And he's the Christ who sends the Spirit of himself. And John speaks of Jesus handing over the Spirit as the blood and the water spilled from his side. And after the resurrection, Jesus appears in the upper room and breathes forth the Spirit upon the disciples with the commission to forgive sins. And the Spirit becomes fully alive within the disciples, uniting them with Jesus. And lastly, the eternal life to all who believe. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is present even now with every disciple, with all of us. In the power of his love and the energy of his Spirit uniting all of us with him. In a gospel that we just heard a few weeks ago, when Jesus said to Thomas, "Have you come to believe because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed." So now I would like to look at the significance of the passion and the death and the resurrection of Christ. Each one of the Gospels approaches it a little bit differently, but each one, this is something that is the center core of all four Gospels. And we know that the man who brought healing was hatefully wounded. The one who reconciled was treated as a sinner. The one who brought life was brutally killed. Jesus' earthly life of compassion and love ended with his death on the cross. But as Christians, we view Jesus' death not as a final defeat, but as that ultimate victory. Victory of life over death, victory of love over selfishness, and victory of God over sin. So we'll look at the cross and Jesus' own experience. In the gospel, Jesus predicts his passion and his death and his resurrection. One thing we need to keep in mind is that the Gospels were written as documents of faith composed in a post-resurrection period. So it's not surprising, therefore, that Jesus' predictions of his passion, death, and resurrection offer very explicit details. It is also not surprising that Jesus' statements talk about his understanding of the salvific meaning of his death. The gospel aids us in understanding the cross in light of the resurrection. And there seems to be some foreknowledge of his death and resurrection as an inevitable event that we see in the Gospels. Now, there are scripture scholars who have questioned the historical accuracy of Jesus' predictions. One reason is because these predictions, they have a number of details that might not have been known beforehand. And they seem to contradict the fear and the despair of the apostles who ran away from the scene. If Jesus had been so clear in his predictions, why were the disciples so shaken at his death, and why were they so surprised at his resurrection? But on the other hand, it would be difficult to understand how Jesus would not have foreseen and talked with his disciples about what was to come. After all, Jesus knew he was on a collision course with the leaders of his day. And because of this knowledge of his knowledge of Old Testament, he knew the fate of many a prophet. So he had to, even if for whatever reason, because of his humanness, if he didn't have a complete understanding of what was going to happen, he knew he was treading on very shaky ground. But scholars have determined that Jesus did foresee, in a general manner, both his death and his resurrection. But the question remains, did he speak of these events to his disciples? And if he did they just not understand, or did they not want to understand? We do hear the story of when, he tells Peter to get behind me, Satan, because he kept saying, oh no, this is not going to happen, and that I will always be there. So that's still one of those open questions that we don't quite know. But so we look now at Jesus' understanding of his death and resurrection. We're pretty sure that Jesus understood his death as a meaningful event in the context of accomplishing his God-given mission. The passion narratives of the Gospels strongly show the influence of Isaiah's suffering servant. So we don't know if this motivated Jesus' intuition into the meaning of his death, because he would have been so familiar with the Old Testament, he would have been aware of Isaiah and what he said, or if it led the early church and the evangelists to come to this conclusion. So that's still one of those open-ended questions. We're pretty sure, though, that Jesus did recognize that the reign of God, which he had come to establish, would become a reality as he journeyed through death. He would also have known that his final surrender to God would bring the entire broken and sinful world forever into the presence of God's unending mercy and forgiveness. The community of Mark, which would have included many first-hand witnesses, remembered Jesus as explicitly linking his life of service, a life dedicated to the eradication of sin in all forms, with his death. Because he made, in Mark we hear, the Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as ransom for many. And we also see in the Gospels Jesus' human experience of his passion and death. That just because Jesus foresaw and may have understood his approaching death and resurrection, it doesn't mean that he accepted his suffering and death easily. Mark portrays Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane as experiencing an overwhelming, almost crushing sorrow with profound apprehension and deep inner turmoil. This had to have been, it had to have been heart-wrenching to have watched this. And this is apparent when Jesus cries out and says, Abba, Father, all things are possible to you. Take this cup away from me. But even in the midst of apprehension and fear, Jesus did display confidence in God's wisdom and saving presence in saying, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Jesus freely chose to surrender to Abba, the Father. Jesus' greatest expression, though, of this struggle and pain is revealed on the cross when he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" At this moment, he must have felt abandoned by the very God he had so valiantly served. This prayer of Jesus leads us to recognize that he had not lost trust in Abba, even as he cried out in anguish, because he was praying to God during this period. It is in this moment that could actually challenge our understanding of the divinity of Jesus. But then Mark helps us to understand when again we hear the Roman centurion say, "Truly, this man was the Son of God," validating what we know. So when we look at the cross and its significance of and power for salvation, we know that salvation is being alive in God as Jesus was alive in God. The cross empowers us to live with a deeper sense of unity, wholeness, and purpose, to live in love, justice, peace, and gratitude. It is a transformation within ourselves and with others. Salvation has a God-centered, transcendent dimension, as well as one of human participation. God and human beings become partners in the journey of life and the achievement of this salvation. And salvation in the Christian tradition involves the eradication of sin. We know that sin isolates us from the transcendent, leaving us powerless and weak. The Christian tradition of salvation involves an experience of being rescued from the powerlessness of sin and our isolation from God. So when we look at the cross of Jesus, and then what it means as far as Christology, the cross reveals the true nature of God. We see that there is no depth of darkness, no moment of human abandonment, no experience of human brokenness that God cannot and will not embrace. No one stands so destitute, so rejected, so despised by humankind as Jesus on the cross. But then no one is so embraced, so deeply loved, and so filled with divine life as Jesus on that same cross. Jesus' passion and death enable us to grasp how unsurmountable that love is. It is the experience of the God of Jesus. It is in surrendering ourselves to God that God reveals his fullness of who God is. It is in dying with and in Christ that one comes to know the never-ending presence and the life of the saving God. Such moments have the potential of revealing God's saving presence for us and the power of leading us to know and experience the heart of Jesus' life. These moments provide us with the personal foundational experiences for doing our own genuine Christology. They enable us to personalize the Christian tradition, which we have received, and offer us occasions for further explorations of our faith. And the cross is the experience of God and of Christ in light of the cross. We know that the cross opens the door for the Christian's church for God in the midst of the brokenness of our world, the shabbiness of life, and the powerlessness of the poor. The experience of God's embrace of Jesus, broken on the cross, tells us that God will embrace and give life to all of us, no matter what the circumstances are, especially in the face of the poor and the downtrodden. The cross of Jesus and the doing of Christology inspires an active love for the poor, no matter how broken. This challenges us to a moral life which excludes no one from our compassion and our love. So we look at the resurrection. And we'll begin with the apostles' vision of the risen Lord. And the vision of the risen Lord from the apostles provided them with the capacity to name the Christ whose presence they witnessed in prayer, word, and sacrament in their midst. Their vision forever determined the shape of their lives and the development of the lives for all disciples of Christ. So the apostles' first-hand witness of the risen Christ is still passed on to us, and that helps us to be able to incorporate that into our faith journey. Their experience and their testimony to the reality of his resurrection must forever be the foremost experience and the interpretation of God's love, which grounds every effort of doing Christology and Christian theology as a whole. The resurrection is the nature of God and human suffering. It is the resurrection, not the cross, which defines who God is and what God is about in the world and with us. We do see God's unending love in the cross, but it is the resurrection that takes it to that next step. The Christian experience of the risen Lord and the belief in God's supreme act of raising Jesus from the dead clearly shows that God does not leave persons to remain in pain. God will not let us remain in misery, nor does he inflict that suffering itself. God supports people in their suffering, and he helps us to find the inner strength to trust, hope, forgive, and to love. Suffering evokes confusion and darkness. But when we have a Christian understanding of suffering in light of the resurrection, it's interpreted as an occasion in which one is not abandoned by God. Suffering can actually be a time to encounter the God of Jesus, the Abba that Jesus knew, and his transforming love of everlasting power and depth. I can't even imagine going through life without having this knowledge and to go through suffering without knowing that there was something there, that God was always going to be there to help pick us up. The resurrection, when it comes to Christian spirituality and asceticism, God does not will harshness or self-punishment or negativity towards ourselves or our life as a way of spiritual growth. But God does desire and blesses our continued efforts to remain faithful in our trust of him, our generosity, even if it means forgiving and loving those who are the most difficult to forgive and to love. The resurrection illustrates decisively that Abba and Abba's son Jesus do not desire to punish, but to forgive and to lift persons to a fuller life. Self-discipline and self-denial are necessary, but not for their own sake. Rather, all discipline needs to be in the service of a godly, Christ-like love. So when we look at the resurrection in light of the cross itself, that Christians do and should proclaim the death of Jesus on the cross. We should honor and reverence the cross, placing crucifixes in our homes and our churches. This helps us in remembering and honoring the inspiring depth of Jesus' fidelity to God. But the cross, in light of the resurrection, is so much more. The cross tells us that love and life are greater than all suffering, even death. That the vastness of living a godly life can deepen even when one suffers profound injustice and acts of sinful vengeance. That the love of life-giving power of God can, and it does, we know for sure, embraces God's children no matter how wounded, how broken, or how despicable they may seem. The cross, in light of the resurrection, tells us that the saving love of God has no limits. And then salvation. It is the resurrection, not the cross, that constitutes the definitive action of God by which we achieve salvation. It is the resurrection that Abba accomplishes and expresses the ultimate and total transformation of Jesus' humanity with divine life. It is the total surrender of Jesus' life and history into the hands of Abba, where he encounters God's love in its fullness. Jesus' resurrection signifies and expresses the desire and the action of God to enable all who encounter God with Jesus to be raised up, to be alive with God as Jesus was and is alive in God. The resurrection is the action of God giving himself to us in everlasting life and love in the gift of salvation. So when we look at a Christological process and the images of Christ, in the evangelists, in looking at the processes that they used, they drew on their beliefs and their traditions. And they retrieved those beliefs and traditions, allowed it to shape their understanding in their present world, and they updated and expanded that belief or tradition to include the most recent and fuller experiences of God. So this is not an initial faith experience of God, but a faith experience already reflected upon, correlated with a variety of themes within the Jewish tradition, and interpreted in light of that tradition. So the images we see in the Gospels are the fruit of the process of doing Christology. Each of the evangelists seeks to interpret his faith experience using these prior traditions, which have already interpreted and articulated a vibrant faith experience. And this can help lead the believer to recognize that God has acted in a continuous way with the past and continues to act in the present in a very new way in and through Jesus. And their experience of God in Jesus' action, his teachings, and in Jesus himself, that we look at what drives this process is that the evangelist or the interpreter has truly encountered the transcendent God alive in and through Jesus. So it's part of that process of really looking at, how am I experiencing God through Jesus? And the images of Christ seek to interpret and clarify as well as to affirm the manner of God's saving presence in the believer. So as the believer's needs change and their longings change, so God's responses to the living Christ also take different changes and different shapes. This calls for a personal transformation. And the experience of God is always transforming. Miracles of healing open up our hearts to gratitude. Proclamation of the new law invites and motivates us to walk concretely in the power of God's reign. The witness of dedicated advocacy for the poor and compassionate mercy motivates and empowers us with an everlasting love and mercy. The believer is changed by the experience of God in Christ, which is reflected in the concrete way of life which the believer embraces. So transformation leads to change. As we are transformed spiritually through the experience of God through Jesus, we can't help but live in a transformative way. So one Christ, one faith. Each of the images of the gospel can enable us to legitimately encounter the living God in Jesus. Each one is sufficient on its own. But on the other hand, no one way in which Jesus reveals himself is totally adequate. Many portraits are necessary to represent the true Christ and the fullness of God's revelation in him. Each image would refine the other, correct the other, maybe amplify the other. As circumstances change in our lives, the images of Christ must change also. As our experience deepens, a new image of God and of Christ as an expression of our further changes of the saving Lord develops. No image is fully satisfying, for it is not an image which one really seeks, but the salvation of developing a deepening relationship with the transcendent God. So when we look at the Gospels and the understanding of Jesus, the New Testament communities clearly understood the humanness of Jesus through the witness of those who shared his ministry, those who spent time with him, who ate with him, who laughed with him, who cried with him. These communities also understood the precise nature of his divine power. They saw his openness to Abba, his surrender to his mission, the depth of his teaching, and the transformational power of his miracles. So they got it. But as time goes on, some of that, and we even see that in John's community, of as time goes by and as people shift from where they were comfortable, things change. So Christianity was strongly influenced by the Hellenistic world. And they were struggling with their New Testament understanding. As Christianity expanded into this world during the 2nd through the 5th centuries, the understandings previously held by Jewish Christians were starting to get muddied. They weren't so clear. Christians would experience Jesus' saving presence in Eucharistic worship, but without the first-hand witness of the apostles in the first 2 centuries, they would start to ask the questions about, is Jesus divine? What is truly the nature of the divine power of Jesus? And the New Testament really doesn't respond decisively to these questions. It presents a variety of ways of understanding the nature and the divine power of Jesus through titles of God's prophet, God's chosen son, servant, anointed, firstborn of all creation. But it also presents Jesus in somewhat of a less than God state, as it calls attention to Jesus' prayerful custom of seeking wisdom from Abba and submitting himself to the will of God, causing later Christians who didn't have that early understanding to misinterpret the sacred writings and to foster serious controversy within the church. The Hellenistic culture had a very diverse way of thinking, this Greek culture, that distinguished itself from the Semitic culture from the apostolic era in the church. The mode of reflection, a characteristic of the Israelites, focused on the historical, concrete events and experiences from which they recognized their truth. But the Hellenistic way of thinking tended to focus upon the transhistorical or transcending historical boundaries. They were much more concerned with the abstract and universal as their criteria for the truth. Hellenistic society viewed historical reality as an imperfect reflection of what was perfect, stable, and universal in a world known primarily by the mind or the reason. So theirs was more of an intellectual understanding. And there were very radical differences within their religious traditions. For the Semite, for those who came from the Israelite tradition, the appearance of Jesus, his prophetic mission, his healing works, and his resurrection constituted the climactic moments of a lengthy history of God's loving kindness towards the Israelites. The Israelites had enjoyed 2,000 years of dialogue and personal involvement with their God, so they understood Jesus in that aspect very deeply. For the Greeks, in the Hellenistic world, the appearance of Jesus would not have been so easily understood in the context of a divine-human interaction. They understood God as distant and uninvolved rather than close and deeply concerned with their welfare. The Hellenistic understanding of God often presented a serious challenge, if not a major obstacle, to the correct understanding of God's work and presence in Jesus. So this was a time for a need for a big theological conversion. That the proclamation of Jesus crucified and risen in the context of Hellenism required a profound conversion before it could embrace the Christological insight and genuine Christ-centered transformation. Clearly, the God of Abraham and Isaac, Moses and Aaron, and David and Solomon was quite different from the God of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and the other Greek philosophers. So there was so many differences that they were facing. So a lot of the challenges of this post-first century church, they were entering into a new stage of doing Christology, interpreting anew their experience of God alive for them in and through Jesus. They could not rely on a common tradition to provide that key that could open up that authentic understanding of Jesus. This expansion of Christianity into the Hellenistic culture created many new challenges for this New Testament church. And it reached a new intensity during this time. They were becoming one church within the Greek world. So this was all new. It was developing right before their eyes. And there became a changing theology of Jesus. It was during this time that several theologians sought to answer the many questions that were arising. They were asking questions like, what was the meaning of Jesus, the Word become flesh? Was Jesus as God's own self or just an image of God? If Jesus was fully divine, how could he be both distinct and one with God the Father at the same time? Theologians were deeply concerned to understand and explain the depths of the reality of salvation in and through Jesus, but they were also wanting to protect the transcendent, the absolute unity and uniqueness of the one true God. So this being in this Hellenistic culture, this being in the world where people were approaching the thought process from a very different perspective, was really challenging everyone to kind of look at who Jesus was and about his divinity and his humanity. So this brought about the Council of Nicea in 325. And the main catalyst for this council was the teaching of Arius. Arius was convinced of the validity of Greek philosophy as a way of interpreting Christian faiths and beliefs. And he held firm to the Hellenistic approach that God's being must be absolutely one. God's transcendence makes it impossible for God to have any contact or relationship with the created world. So they're seeing God as out there, not someone who can have a relationship with humanity. In Arius' teaching, Jesus cannot be God in the proper sense of the term. He can be a mediator only in the sense of being secondary or a subordinate. Jesus is the first in the order of creation, superior to everything created, God's agent in creation, but according to Arius, not God. He is divine, but only in a secondary sense. If Arius was correct, we would all have to acknowledge that in Jesus, we could not encounter God nor experience salvation in the Lord. He would serve as nothing more than a good example to follow. And along with Arius was the teachings of Athanasius. He believed that if Christ were not truly God, we would not be redeemed, for only the immortal God could redeem us from our inclinations to selfishness and sin. He believed that Christians, in and through Jesus, experience salvation precisely in this form. Therefore, the Word, or Logos as he became known, in taking flesh of Jesus, necessarily both reveals and communicates God's very self to humankind. So we had these two differing views that were going on. So in order to resolve these issues, they had their gathering in Nicea, which is located in modern-day Turkey. They came together to condemn the teaching of Arius and to affirm their conviction that the Jesus, as Logos, was one in being with the Father, a statement later incorporated into our Eucharistic liturgy. This formula was articulated in Greek as homoousios, which the literal translation would be same fundamental nature, same substance, same being, same basic reality. The Father and the Son absolutely equal one God. So just by changing some of the terminology, it became more transparent to them. So the teaching of the Council of Nicea is that they determined that Jesus, or Logos, is fully divine, equal to the Father, the same true God as the Father is God. The Logos and the Father are one in being or of the same substance. In Jesus, one meets God's very self. The Council formally refused to accept any suggestions that the Logos was created, no matter how exalted it might be. Now, the question of the divine nature of Jesus, that even though they denounced the teaching of Arius, they really didn't definitively define or describe the divine nature of Jesus. Neither did it engage in a discussion of precisely how that nature related to Jesus of Nazareth. The Council, through the use of the word homoousios, formally introduced non-biblical Hellenistic terminology into official Christian theology and into solemn Christian statements of belief. So they did help bridge that gap, but there were still some loose ends. So the outcome was that they clarified and advanced the Christian understanding of the Logos in the nature of the divine power in Jesus and of the transcendent depth of salvation by the crucified and the risen Lord. Although it didn't resolve all the questions, it did answer how Logos could and actually did relate to Jesus of Nazareth. So the final result from the Council of Nicea is the Nicene Creed that continues to be the core belief of our Christian faith. So because there were still a lot of questions, this led to the Council of Constantinople. This was the first one. They had one later, but this was in 381. And this is when the humanity of Jesus was being called into question. The original disciples never questioned the humanity of Jesus. He was regarded as the carpenter's son, the man born of Mary. This was not a question for the post-apostolic writers either. They had lived with him. They knew him. But this is where the influence of Gnosticism was coming in. The Gnostic sects regarded all matter, which would be in flesh, as evil, which promoted some question the reality of Jesus' flesh. They would ask the question, how could God immerse his divine self in something that's evil? And the other heresy that was going around was brought in by the Docetists, who regarded Jesus' humanity as a mere appearance, but not real. For the Docetists, redemption and the role of Jesus consisted in freeing the spiritual, non-material dimension of men and women from the material world, which it was trapped in. So it was during this time that Irenaeus wrote the work Against Heresies, where he strongly defended the full humanity of Jesus. And Tertullian, another theologian of the time, also rejected the Docetists and the Gnostics in general, insisting that the flesh is an object of God's love. And this was also when the Eastern Church and they were having an issue with the interpretation of the word sarx. The Eastern theologians began denying not the flesh or the body of Christ, but the reality of Christ's human soul. The New Testament uses the Greek word sarx, which literally means flesh or of the whole person, body and soul, mind, heart, flesh and bone. This was the understanding especially of the writer of the Gospel of John, and also of Paul when he wrote about the flesh spirit with no distinction between body and soul. But for the Greek mind, this Greek word for them meant material body distinguished from the soul or the mind. So this left open the question of whether or not Jesus had assumed a human soul. Arius also had denied that Jesus had a human soul, maintaining that the Logos itself had taken the place of the human soul in Jesus. So, the outcome of this council in Constantinople is that the principal concern was upholding the truth and the reality of Christian salvation. God had granted human beings the gift of divine life, and if Christ were not fully human, then the gift established by the incarnation of the Logos, fulfilled through Christ's death and resurrection, would not have been given truly to us as human beings. Basically, what they were saying is that this gift would have been given to a creature radically different than us. The council corrected the ambiguity in the Nicene Creed, dropping the phrase, born from the being of the Father, which this was a phrase that had created doubt and even denial in the fullness of Jesus' humanity. So the council determined that we, like Jesus, have been embraced by God. We can find God in the depth of whatever is human, in the breadth of every human experience. While the council did not answer every question concerning Jesus, it assures us that we, in our entirety of our humanity, just like Jesus, have been embraced by God. So the next conflict they had was the idea of one person, two natures for Jesus, and which led to trying to develop the theology of the word person. In Hellenistic philosophy during the early post-apostolic era, they used the word prosopon, or in English the word person, to designate individual human beings. And this word originally meant either the human face or a mask that was worn by an actor during a performance. The term was deemed to be inadequate in the midst of all these debates that were happening in the 4th century. It was adequate in respect to human beings, but not in understanding the divine. So the Council of Nicea had declared that Jesus was totally divine, one in being with the Father. The question was then asked, how then is the Logos, or Jesus, distinguished from the Father? The word person denoted a concrete, autonomous individual, which would imply that if the term were used with Jesus, would there be two separate beings or two gods? So they started to develop the understanding of three persons in one God. This was the beginning of the theology of the Trinity. So following the Council of Nicea, the theologians began to examine other forms of terminology that could explain this reality of God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They chose the word homostasius, meaning active realization or manifestation. Homostasius denotes a dynamic dimension within a concrete reality. This offered some new insights and opportunities to understand and speak of the Logos, relationship to Jesus, preserving both the full humanity of Jesus and his divinity. Now, also at this time, there was becoming a rivalry between Constantinople and Alexandria. Nestorius, the bishop of Constantinople, said that Mary, the mother of Jesus, could not be called mother of God, but must be referred to as a recipient of God. Nestorius' theory was that in Jesus there were two active and independent subjects. Mary gave birth to the human subjects. Well, this did not sit well with Cyril, the Bishop of Alexandria, who followed the conclusions of the Council of Nicea. So this led to the Council of Ephesus in 431, where it reached its peak. Both parties from Constantinople and Alexandria, they met separately, proceeded to excommunicate one another, causing both civil and ecclesial division. Well, the ecclesial leaders at the time, in their wisdom, responded by recognizing only the session that Cyril had presided, condemning that of Nestorius. They wanted to stay true to the Council of Nicea. They determined that the eternal Son of the Father and the Son of the Virgin Mary are one in the same. And this was followed 20 years later with the Council of Chalcedon, where the two positions were united in one formula and one profession of faith. So the outcome of that was that we affirm that the one and the same Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son, must be acknowledged in two natures without confusion or change, without division or separation. The distinction between the natures was never abolished by their union, but rather the character proper to each of these two natures was preserved as they came together in one person. He is not split or divided into two persons, but he is one and the same only begotten, God the Word, the Lord Jesus Christ. So basically, through these councils, we have our current day understanding of the total humanity and the divinity of Jesus. So the insights of the Council of Ephesus and Chalcedon. That in affirming that the personal dynamic center of Jesus of Nazareth is none other than the eternal Logos, the eternal Son of God, Christians confess their convictions that when Jesus teaches, God teaches. When Jesus speaks words of encouragement, God speaks words of encouragement. When Jesus heals, God heals. When Jesus forgives, God forgives. When Jesus rejoices, God rejoices. When Jesus struggles, God struggles. When Jesus suffers, God suffers. When Jesus empties himself in love, God pours God's self out in love. So when we look at Christology, and when we look at, how this applies to our life today, and the process, the Christological processes that the early evangelists went through to create the Gospels, where we can draw those interpretations, those traditions, those beliefs to help us with our own processes of how do we determine and what do we say. When Jesus asked us, who do you say that I am? What are those that, how does Jesus relate to us? Just as Jesus experienced Abba and spoke clearly of him, as Christians who are alive in Christ, we can come to know Abba as well. Just as Jesus knew him in such a familiar form, Abba or Daddy. We too are rooted in God's eternity from the very beginning. That our lives have been with God for all eternity. We too have been created and recreated in the eternal Word. As believers, we have a source of life and love within us that enables us to live and to love as Jesus did, where we can form the body of Christ here on earth. We can take where Jesus ended, we take that and we take Jesus' mission as our own. Just as the evangelists in the Gospels were trying to let the people know that it's okay if Jesus hasn't come back. That what I'm giving you, these beliefs, what I'm telling you in these Gospels are going to help us move forward into the future. The good news of the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus is that through Him, we and God have become one. It isn't a process that has to happen. It's already happened. If we've done any kind of Christology at all in our lives, God is already part of who we are. One in being, one in mind, one in heart. And as it was true since the apostles first gave witness to the risen Lord, the church has been concerned itself with the question of who Jesus is in order to preserve and to foster the experience of salvation, which all of us are to enjoy. The mystery of Christ and the mystery of salvation, of Christian salvation, are one and the same. So that as we look to the Scriptures, as we look to the Gospels, as we sit and we reflect on what's going on in our lives, and we look at the communities of each one of those Gospels, and we see what are the struggles, what are the challenges, what are the joys that they're living at any given time, and how do those relate to my joys and my struggles and my challenges, and how do I bring that so that with the experience of Jesus, with the reality of Jesus, how do I help to develop my relationship with God? So in order to be able to reflect on this a little deeper, I've got some questions that I would like you to reflect on. Of how has your faith in Christ been fostered and shaped by the beliefs of your faith community? How have you been able to, what is it when you're doing, you can do this Christological process right within your parish, within your faith-sharing group, within, and how have they, has your faith been changed because of some of that? Which images of Jesus described in the Gospels attract or speak to you the most? Are they the images from Mark or from Matthew or from Luke or those from John that are a little harder for us to wrap our heads around? But what are those images that are speaking to you at this point in time? In what ways would you see the Johannine community, the community of John's experience and images of Jesus, as complementary to the synoptic community's experience and images? So even though they're very different in some aspects, how do they complement each other? When I talked about how that John's gospel was basically starting where the others had ended, so how do they complete what the synoptic gospels started? And what similarities do you see between the plight of Israel in Jesus' time and the plight of your community and or the world today? So a lot of the things that they were dealing with back then, they may be historically different or culturally different, but as far as what the people were feeling, what they were experiencing, could be very similar to what we experience in today's world. So to reflect on that and see, how that compares. And how does the image of God's love and acceptance of Jesus broken on the cross, as well as the life and the love of Jesus directed towards the marginalized, affect your understanding of the way of Christian discipleship? How does this influence How does this change your understanding? How does this affirm your understanding of discipleship? Then how would you explain why Christ's divinity and the affirmation of the Council of Nicea is absolutely necessary for our salvation? How does this play into our everlasting life with God in heaven? And lastly, in what ways have you experienced the presence and the power of the risen Lord in your own life? What are those ways that you felt the risen Lord in helping you to overcome the pain, the anguish that you might have been feeling in your life, and that you felt like, the risen Lord had reached out to you and had helped you to move forward in your journey of faith? So for Christology, the main resource would be the Bible. I like my Little Rock Catholic Study Bible, but any Bible, any Catholic Bible would do. To be able to go back, to take the time to go back and read the Gospels again, to take each one and try to, in light of what we've learned today, to look and see, what was going on? What was being said around the edges? What are the underlying currents that maybe I've missed before? Or when we hear the Gospels read on the Sunday Mass or during the weekday, what are some of those things that maybe I can hear it with new ears? I can be able to interpret it just a little bit differently. And also, an excellent resource, and I was only able to just barely touch a lot of what Gerald Lutenberger had in his book of the Introduction to Christology in the Gospels of the Early Church. But it's an excellent resource to be able to answer the question, who do you say that I am? And so if you get a chance to get this resource, it's very easy to obtain through Amazon or some other avenue, but it was really wonderful to have. And then, of course, our diocese Office of Catechesis, which, has changed a little bit over the last year, but I know that Jackie is always there to be able to help, to be able to, answer any questions that you have and be able to provide resources that maybe you're in need of. So I would like to close with this little closing prayer. And it's basically just a little part from Luke, and it really does set the tone for who Jesus was, what his mission was here on earth. So I'd like to begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim a year acceptable to the Lord. Amen. Thank you, and I hope that you find this information helpful and that you'll be able to enter into your own Christology processes into the future.